A lot of political issues have been taking place over the past little while. Obviously, you have the Trump indictment, an issue that has been getting a lot of coverage by various media news organizations. But you also have, as of recently, the Tennessee 3-1 lawmaker, Justin Jones, has just been reinstated by the Nashville County Commission into the state legislature. Justin J. Pearson is still awaiting to be reinstated. Obviously, and that is another hot button issue that is being discussed in the U.S. Joining me now to discuss the latest, Joe Walsh, a former Republican congressman, former presidential candidate, and Michael Hopkins, Democratic strategist. Hello to the both of you. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having us.
Michael, let me begin with you with this, and I'll start out with the issue of the Tennessee 3. With these three lawmakers, now 2 out of 3 of them are back in the legislature. One of them is expected to be reinstated tomorrow, as long as everything kind of goes according to plan. What do you make of everything that took place to now get us to this point?
Well, first off, I think this was a spectacular overreach by Republicans. I think what you saw was a attempted power grab that backfired. Their attempt to kick them out really resulted in them getting the Tennessee 3 getting more attention, getting more notoriety, getting more focus on what's going on in the legislature there. And it really excited people in Tennessee. I mean, the crowds that you're seeing, the youth exuberance that you're seeing on the ground, I think is something that you're going to see across the country. We saw in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court is now tilted towards Democrats. You're seeing on the ground in Tennessee, young people excited to vote. And that's what we saw in the midterms in 2022. And I think that that's just going to be something that leads in 2024 to Democrats having continued success.
And Joe, on the issue of the Tennessee 3, what was ultimately the main point? I mean, Republicans obviously knew going into this that, they could just be reinstated. It's not, news that they can be. And it's a very quick turnaround time, given that they were just expelled recently. Now, again, Justin Jones already reinstated, one of them expected to be reinstated, Gloria Johnson. They didn't get the result that they were looking for in regards to her. She was able to remain in her capacities by 1 vote. So I guess what was the overall point of this for Republicans?
Why it was just really stupid. I mean, let's just call it what it is. Michael nailed it. I mean, just at one level, what a politically stupid thing to do. Maybe they didn't know how quickly these 2 could be reinstated. If they didn't, they should have. But the bigger, broader point is what went down in Tennessee last week is just further evidence of how my former political party is pretty much anti-democracy. I mean, 2 years ago, they tried to overturn an American election. And last week, they expelled 2 duly elected state representatives. My former political party, Wyatt, no longer believes in democracy.
And Michael, a lot of people are arguing specifically on the Republican side. I mean, there are some people who are perhaps arguing that expulsion wasn't the right option, but that, there, I guess, should be some sort of consequence for protesting on the floor of the state legislature. What do you make of that argument, given that, the floor of the state legislature isn't generally a traditional protesting setting?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if there are rules about decorum, then people should obviously follow that. But let's put the real focus on what they were talking about. Kids were killed the week before by firearms. We have a firearm problem in this country, and that comes from someone who is a gun owner. The access that people have to firearms is a problem, and we need to have a conversation about it. And Republicans' failure to have that conversation is now becoming a problem for them at the ballot box. And so when you have kids outside that building protesting, skipping school so that they can come out and talk about the fact that they no longer feel safe in schools. That's really what the focus is. So for Republicans to use 2 African Americans who used a bullhorn as on the floor, when you have the Speaker of the House not living in the district that he's supposed to represent, when you have someone who's a member of that legislature who is convicted of child sex crimes, but yet the person you want to expel are 2 young African Americans who are speaking up. Not only those are optics problems, but what you're seeing is 2 forms of rules. rules for Republicans and rules for Democrats. And that at its essence is a real threat to democracy. And that is bigger than just Tennessee. We're seeing it all over the country. And we're seeing it, like Joe mentioned, in elections. And that should be the real worry as Democrats head into 2024, that it's not necessarily who wins the election. It's going to be who is willing to fight for democracy.
And Joe, I want to go back to what Michael mentioned. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on these representatives, and yes, it is extremely important. But the overall messaging behind this was because of the school shooting at the Covenant Christian School in Nashville. So I guess on both sides, Republicans, who are obviously the ones who initiated this, and then Democrats who obviously have, so to speak, been kind of the victim of it in the sense that they have had some of their lawmakers expelled. Putting all of that aside, how can, politicians kind of turn off the political switch to actually put the focus on what it should be?
It's difficult because we're really extremely divided right now. Look, these two legislators, let's be clear, they broke the rules and they should have been penalized, but not expelled. Not expelled. They should have been censored. They could have been dealt with by the ethics committee, whatever. But Michael makes a good point. Republicans have a super majority down in Tennessee. Look, Michael and I probably disagree on most things when it comes to gun policy in this country. But doggone it, let's have that debate. And I've got no problem with Democratic legislators and anybody protesting. There's a long history of civil disobedience in this country. That's all fine and well. We do need to have that bigger, broader debate because there's a real divide on that issue in this country.
And let me say, I've joined Joe's show and we had that conversation about guns and how I feel that what guns you want to have in your house, that is your purview. But once you leave that threshold and cross into society, there needs to be a different conversation about what you can carry in your day-to-day responsibilities because we have law enforcement. And I think that's a broader conversation to be had because there's going to be disagreement, but you know what? That's how we get consensus.
So perhaps, Michael, I'll ask you this too then before we go on to the Trump indictment. When we look at what's been happening, obviously a kind of a broader conversation around gun violence, around potential, restrictions to accessing firearms, et cetera. Where, and I guess what do you make of where the various people, various political parties, et cetera, are kind of falling on that issue, given that, the Democrats have, traditionally been, calling for not necessarily more restrictions, but, stricter access for those who potentially could do harm with it. And then you have the Republicans who don't really seem to want, very many restrictions at all.
Look, Justice Scalia, who I don't agree with on very much, but even in his wisdom said that the Second Amendment is not absolute, that there are restrictions on what you can have. And so I think what really is the plague on our system is money in politics, because when you get a lot of Republicans behind closed doors and when you get a lot of Democrats behind closed doors, we all agree that there needs to be some consistency and consistency in how our gun laws are applied. And so I think that the problem is that the pressure is coming from outside groups and people feel like it's more important that they stay in office rather than doing the right thing. And at some point we need to have politicians who have the courage to lose their office so that they can do what they were elected to do in the first place, which is protect Americans.
And Wyatt, the only thing I'll add to what Michael just said is, and your audience needs to understand this, unlike the rest of the civilized world, we do have this thing called the Second Amendment. It makes America very unique. And Michael's right, no amendment in our Constitution is absolute. Free speech isn't absolute. I think that the area of common ground is to do everything we can in this country before a gun is bought, yes, to make sure that somebody who shouldn't have a gun doesn't get a gun. So strengthening background checks, universal background checks, red flag laws, all of these things, I think the two sides could come together on. When we start talking about banning certain guns, you're going to lose people on one side in this country. Just my thought.
And just to add real quick on to Joe's point, because I think he makes a great point. I'm taking flight lessons right now. It is harder for me to get a pilot's license than it is for me to go and buy a gun from Walmart. That's a
Interesting. Let me ask too about as it pertains to the Trump indictment. I talked to Cy Vance yesterday, and there's a lot of people who are talking about the fact that perhaps Cy Vance had, at least somewhat of an equivalent amount of evidence as Alvin Bragg did to make this indictment, and then he kind of, put his foot on the brakes and then wanted Alvin Bragg to have to make this final decision. And then you also have kind of a conflicting narrative that perhaps, new evidence might have just came about, what have you, lots of different potential perspectives on that. I guess, Joe, I'm just wondering what you make on that. I mean, do you think that as it relates to this, because the other thing is Republicans have been making this argument that it is in some way a political prosecution. So I guess I'm just wondering what you make of all of it.
Well, understand, Republicans will say that about every indictment. When Georgia indicts him for trying to overthrow Georgia's election results, they will say political witch hunt, and the same with the Justice Department. Look, I don't know why maybe Michael has some insight. What we do know about Bragg in this New York indictment is when Bragg first got elected, he wanted nothing to do with this. In fact, two of his top prosecutors resigned because Bragg wouldn't pursue Trump on this. So I don't know if it's new information. When the indictment came out, there wasn't a lot of new information. So I hope there's more there once he really gets into it, because this indictment on its own, even though no one's above the law, and I want to see Trump held accountable for everything, this indictment alone politically is going to help Trump within the Republican Party.
And Michael, on one of the kind of newest developments with this, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is now suing the House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan in order to in efforts to kind of block the GOP inquiry into the Trump case, which I think obviously speaks to kind of a broader issue pertaining again to the Republicans' reaction to this indictment. What do you make of that?
Only for a safer party that speaks all about state rights. All they seem to do is want federal intrusion. And to a broader point that Joe was talking about, I was a public defender in Manhattan. I've tried cases against not Bragg, but against Cy Vance's office. Let me say this. I in no way believe that Alvin Bragg would bring a case against Donald Trump, such a historic case, that he didn't believe he could win. That would be foolish and would tarnish his reputation throughout history. New York is unique in that you don't have to turn over full discovery until the trial, right before the trial begins. So Alvin Bragg has no reason to turn over all of his cards and show his hand. And I think that's actually smart, because what he would do is spend the next year defending evidence and having his entire case picked apart before he actually gets to trial. So I think what he's doing is trying to show enough to show that the indictment was legitimate, which, look, grand jury of Donald Trump's peers indicted him on 34 felonies. And whether or not we think that the case is strong or weak, the evidence that we've seen so far, and it's going to be a real business records evidence. It's not going to be a lot of testimony. We're going to see David Pecker, and we're probably going to see Michael Cohen, but we can look at the records themselves. And if they show that those numbers were fake or inflated, that's it. And I think what we've really learned over the last 6 to 8 years is we've got to hold people accountable. It doesn't matter whether they're president or whether they're Joe Schmo on the corner, because when you fail to hold people accountable, it makes the rule of law fungible. And that's exactly at its essence what happens when democracies fail. And
Wyatt, Michael's correct that in New York, there's no legal obligation for Bragg to show his hand. Michael's a smart, wise political strategist as well. I wish politically, I think he had a political obligation a week and a half ago now to have shown more. I think that would have helped. And look, I agree with Michael that it would be political suicide for Bragg to bring this case forward if, let's be real, he didn't think he could turn these misdemeanors into felonies. Because you don't want to go after a former president for misdemeanors. So I'm assuming he's got stuff there to turn these into felonies. I just wish he had politically risen to the moment a little bit better. What's your take on that, Michael?
I think he was very worried that had he put too much information in the original charging document, that this case isn't going to go to trial until 2024 during the primary. And so he would spend between now and 2024 defending a case in the public opinion court rather than in the trial courts. And, when you have that happen, you got David Pecker, who's going to testify. And that means for the next year, you're going to have people chipping away at witnesses, at the credibility of witnesses, at the credibility of documents. And I just think he worries that that would taint the jury pool and make it really hard, where you end up actually maybe granting Trump the opportunity to have the trial move to a different jurisdiction.
And Wyatt, the broader context here is, if the three of us are talking in another month and a half, we could be talking about another one or two much more important indictments.
Yeah, so let me ask you about that too, just before we conclude, because I know that you are a firm believer, as you've told me before, that you believe this will be the first of many indictments for the former president. And as you just said, the ones to come could potentially be a lot more serious. With the Manhattan case in particular, we know that we won't hear very much more pertaining to it until most probably later this year. So I guess I'm just wondering, what are you expecting the timeline to be like for potential other indictments, and how significant could those be?
I think, and I'll be curious what Michael says, but I think we're going to hear from Georgia next. And I think we're going to hear from Georgia sometime in May. And I expect Trump to be indicted. Again, the president of the United States pressured the top election official in the state of Georgia to find him 11,780 votes. And I think there are more phone calls where that came from. So I think Trump's going to be indicted within a couple months down in Georgia. I think Trump is really afraid, Wyatt, of this classified documents probe. Because it's clear Trump obstructed a lot when it comes to that as well.
Michael,
Yeah, I think Joe's completely right. I think Trump world is more worried about the Georgia case, because Georgia has a unique statute which mirrors the federal RICO law statute. And so I think in that case, you're going to see a lot of indictments of not just Trump, but the people around him, the Rudy Giuliani's, that circle of people, potentially the head of the GOP party in Georgia. And that's really going to be the one where his circle is going to feel the pressure. I think the federal case, you're already hearing Barr talk about how it's likely that not only is he indicted, but convicted because he was, quote unquote, jerking around the feds. Yeah. It's looking really tough for Donald Trump these days. And the more he talks, the more the noose starts to tighten. And you heard a couple days ago, Fani Willis say, if he continues to threaten people, if he continues to intimidate witnesses, she will add charges. And she is not a joke. She has already indicted and convicted teachers' unions during the scandals in Georgia. She's going after gangs in Georgia right now. This is a prosecutor who is serious and who's going to take her time. And they are impaneling a new jury the first week of May. So I think that's when we should look for charges to be, for the indictments to come down.
But Wyatt, all of these indictments will help Trump win the nomination, but they will hurt his chances to ever get reelected again.
It's going to alienate suburban voters all across the country.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Former GOP Congressman Joe Walsh and Democratic strategist Michael Hopkins. Thanks so much to the both of you for making the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Wyatt.